Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Welcome, and thank you for joining us to learn more about FPWA's most recent report, Caught in the Gaps. We are excited this morning to have Senator Persaud and Assemblywoman Rosenthal join us. You'll get a chance and an opportunity to also hear from Julia Casey, our lead policy analyst in this report, and Joe Jones, our Director of Policy, Advocacy, and Research, who will walk us through some recommendations that are laid out in the report later in the program. I'm Raisa Rodriguez. I'm the Chief Program and Policy Officer at FPWA. A little bit about FPWA before we get started. We are an anti-poverty policy and advocacy organization. Since 1922, FPWA has driven groundbreaking policy reforms to better serve those in need. We work to dismantle systemic barriers that impede economic security and well-being, and strengthen the capacity of human services agencies and faith organizations. Next slide. Before we get started, a little bit about how we got here and how we got to really examining cash assistance. Again, as an anti-poverty organization, FPWA has long looked into the role of the benefit system at really achieving its stated goals. About 2 years ago, we started a research process and put out a report that you all may recall or have seen called Push to the Precipice, where we really examined how benefit cliffs play out in New York. And through that work, we learned that New York actually has some important protections in place that minimize what could be harmful benefit cliffs, but that despite that, there is much to be desired in terms of having a stronger benefit system in place in New York. And while benefit cliffs were not prevalent in many of our benefit systems, that there are several gaps that really ensure that people remain in economic deprivation, right? Whether it's the difficult ways that we put in place to limit access to important benefits, whether it's administrative burdens that prove to be incredibly costly to navigate, or whether it's just merely not enough to really move individuals that are in need out of poverty. Gaps are in place that really limit the effectiveness of many of the benefit systems that New Yorkers rely on. That prompted us to really research and take into account how and where gaps play in our benefit systems. As you can imagine, this was an enormous task. There were many different ways that we could have handled and approached this work. But through lit review and stakeholder engagements, we decided to really lift the hood, if you will, on New York's cash assistance programs. The reason we did that is because it is one of the benefit systems in which these financial gaps are most prevalent, and because it really aims to serve New Yorkers that are most in need. Before we get started, I also want to recognize that FPWA strongly believes that even if we were to fix all that is broken with our benefit system, and we implemented all the recommendations that are outlined that you'll hear later in today's program related to how we can improve benefits in New York, it will not be enough. That these recommendations, these policy efforts aimed at improving our benefit systems and income supports must be done in tandem with what are critical structural work to reform what we know are harmful structural barriers that maintain economic deprivation. And so our report also outlines what are critical structural reforms that are necessary, whether it's having more reliable ways of measuring need, or really being honest with ourselves about what it costs to actually get by and thrive in New York. So again, I thank you for joining us. We're excited to dig into some of this work. Before we begin on the findings of our research, I'm going to turn it to Senator Persaud, who has been a critical champion in this work. Senator, thank you for joining us. I'd love if you can share with our viewers today your thoughts on cash assistance in New York, why this is such an important issue to elevate at this moment, and how these structural reforms that are necessary play into this work as well.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Reza, for inviting me to give a few brief comments on your report and the importance of the work that you're doing. Again, thanks to everyone for joining this important announcement. I'm Senator Roxanne Persaud, and I represent the 19th Senate District, and I am the chairperson of the State Senate Social Services Committee. I'm delighted that FPWA has undertaken this granular research to exemplify New Yorkers' plight to make ends meet. It is an important topic. It is one that we talk about on a daily basis because too many New Yorkers are, struggling to make ends meet in a state that should not be happening. While I'm still working through, the entire report to really dive into the substance and to share the information with my colleagues, I can say that FPWA has put the data behind several of the policy changes that I've been advocating for and that I will continue to advocate for. I've partnered with Assemblymember Rosenthal, and you'll hear from her shortly. I've partnered with her to ensure that we increase the access to grants for New Yorkers. New Yorkers need this increase. It's unthinkable when we sit down and say people are being denied cash assistance, people are being denied services, people they're reaching this level where they get $1 more and they fall off and their services are denied. We have to make sure we are changing that. Inflation and cost of living and all of these things, we have to ensure that the grants that we're offering to New Yorkers match that so that they continue to live. FPWA has undertaken significant research on on the benefit cliffs. And that's the situation that individuals and families face when they're trying to work their way out of poverty. As a chair of social services, I always say that our goal is to ensure we're lifting people out of poverty. We're not giving them a hand out, we are giving them a hand up. And that's what the Social Services Committee is about. Benefits begin to disappear when people earn $1 more. That is unacceptable, and we're continuing to fight those cliffs. Flattening the benefit cliffs can alleviate the significant caseloads that we are seeing, and we know that people are suffering because of these caseloads, and we need to address that. We have legislation that we're talking about where New York is completing job training programs or entering the workforce where that will not be counted against them when they're applying for their benefits. These are some things, again, to help people, to lift them out of poverty. We should always be thinking of how is it that we can lift someone up, lift families up. That's the role that I play. What does it mean when we are talking about living in poverty? There's so many definitions of living in poverty. We have what the federal government sees, what the state sees, what the local government sees. We have to ensure that we're coming together as one, because the people of the state of New York are one people, regardless of what jurisdiction is covering the benefit. And so we all have to work together to ensure that we offer the people of the state of New York the best services possible. And so we will continue to work to alleviate those burdens on New Yorkers. We continue to see, we're continuing to use the federal poverty level, While the federal poverty level, when applied, does not benefit the people in Brownsville the same way it may benefit someone on Staten Island. So we have to look at that. How do we ensure that we bring everything into alignment and giving the people the best that we can offer? And then finally, my team and I will continue to work with FPWA and review the points of the self-study standards, trying to be accountable to New Yorkers to make sure New Yorkers are thriving, regardless of where in the state they're living. People tend to say, oh, well, you're living in New York City, you have access to more, and you can offer, you have more, and there's so much that we can, but we have to make sure that regardless of where in the state you're living, you have the same services. I'll continue to advocate for bills about benefit cliffs, self-study standards. We're working on that. Hopefully we can get it done this year. Again, I am looking forward to working with FPWA and all of the social service partners to ensure that when we're talking about cash assistance, benefit cliffs, whatever in the social services arena, that we are ensuring all New Yorkers are receiving what they should to move them out of poverty. That is our aim, to move the people who are living based, at the edge of their seat because they're not sure if they can afford tomorrow, moving them from there. And so that when we can finally say we have eliminated the benefit cliffs, we've moved people out of poverty. God bless us here in the state of New York. We will continue to do so. So again, FPWA, thank you for being my partner in this endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator. Thank you for your remarks. Thank you for your leadership in this work. We look forward to partnering with you. To our viewers and our participants this morning, stay tuned for ways that you also can be engaged in partnership for this important work. Thank you, Senator Persaud, for joining us. I'm going to turn now to Assemblywoman Rosenthal, who has been an important champion in this work as well, elevating the need to really meet the needs of New Yorkers and improving our cash assistance systems in New York. She is the newly appointed housing chair, and we're excited to have her this morning. Assemblywoman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Raisa, and thank you for having me. I am Linda Rosenthal. I represent the Upper West Side and parts of Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan. And as Raisa said, I was chair of Social Services Committee about 7 days ago, and now I'm chair of the Housing Committee. But, all issues are interlinked. If you don't have money, you have no housing. And so, this is all part of an effort on the part of lawmakers in New York to lift people up and to ensure their safety, their health, and of course, their ability to buy food to succeed in life. So I'm so happy to be joining the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, and I thank you for all your advocacy over the years, and particularly for this comprehensive report that highlights the pitfalls of cash assistance and the gaps that currently exist. I'm glad to be here with my colleague, Senator Persaud, as well. So last session, I introduced a package of legislation that would finally increase these cash assistance grants to the levels needed to get by today, and to make other adjustments that protect households from falling off the benefits cliff. Together, these bills would create a public assistance system that does what it was originally intended to do, and that is to help lift people out of poverty. Since March 2020, almost 3 years, the COVID pandemic and the economic fallout has placed an enormous burden on families and individuals across the state. At the height of the pandemic, and a lot of this has not abated yet, there are lines wrapped around the block as families waited to get groceries from food pantries. People got unemployment and cash assistance programs so they could put food on the table and care for their families. But the economic fallout is still felt by so many people. There's inflation, as Senator Persaud talked about, and an increased cost of living, not just here in New York, but nationwide. So families can't pay their rent on time. They can't pay their utility bills. They can't buy groceries, and many are left to apply for public assistance just to try to get by. So the pandemic made things worse for low-income New Yorkers, but the fact of the matter is this cash assistance program has been paltry for quite some time, and these grants should have been increased years ago. Across the state, thousands of low-income people rely on them to cover housing, utilities, basic necessities, but the amount of money provided is not enough to meet basic needs. FPWA's report illustrates how our restrictive asset limits, exclusionary eligibility criteria, and difficult to navigate application process has put us way behind other states. A report in City Limits showed the median rent for one bedroom in New York had hit $3,267, 20% increase from just 3 years ago. The cost of housing has risen exponentially across the state since 2003. However, for single adults, they're receiving the same monthly grant they would have received for rent in 1988. The allowances given to help the cost of utilities are not any better. The last time these grants were increased was in 81 and 86, meaning that a single adult household still receives $25.10 per month to offset their utility costs. It's unacceptable. My bills would raise each of those grants to account for inflation, put more money in the pockets of those facing the greatest needs so they can make their monthly expenses. But rather than helping help New Yorkers escape poverty, New York's inadequate cash assistance program contribute to a continued cycle of poverty. Each year that we fail to fix our cash assistance program, we see it play out in higher rates of hunger, lower graduation rates, poorer health outcomes, and so much more. How can we ever expect people on public assistance to reach economic independence if the cash assistance doesn't help meet their needs today, their most basic needs? So we're 2023 session just began. We are powered up. We are pumped, and with FPWA and other advocacy organizations taking the lead on this, I am confident that we will expand assistance to people in poverty, help them gain their economic independence and have much better lives. So thank you so much for your wonderful report, and I look forward to continued close working together. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Assemblywoman. Thank you for joining us this morning. And we look forward to your continued partnership and leadership in this work. Thank you. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Julia Casey, our lead policy analyst on this work. We have a lot of ground to cover. Julia, I'll let you start off with some of these important findings we've revealed in this report.
Thank you, Raisa. And I just want to say again, thank you to Assemblymember Rosenthal and Senator Persaud for joining us, and just for all your leadership on these issues. It's really wonderful to have a chance to hear from both of you directly about the important work you're doing, and we're looking forward to working with you. And so now we're going to move into the briefing portion of the program where, as Raisa said, we're going to share some of our findings and our recommendations as well. And please note as well, just a quick housekeeping note, we did allot until 11:30 for the briefing. We're going to try to end closer to 11 just to give folks some time back. We know it's a busy week. So just keep that in mind as well. And so to begin, we just wanted to provide a brief, very brief overview of what cash assistance is. So starting back in 1996, a law called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which is commonly referred to as welfare reform, was passed. And this replaced a program that was formerly called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and replaced it with the TANF block grant, so the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families block grant. And this included time limits and work requirements and added exclusions for many immigrants on their eligibility for the first 5 years that they were in the So the TANF block grant can be used to fund a wide variety of benefits and services. We're focusing just on the cash assistance part of the program. And so with TANF funding, New York State established what's called the Family Assistance Program. And this program operates under federal TANF guidelines and provides assistance to families. And then the state also established a sort of parallel program that is funded by the state and the counties to provide cash assistance to those who don't qualify for family assistance. So this might be individuals without children, or families who've exceeded the time limit for family assistance, and a few other categories of folks as well. Next slide. So we wanted to include this slide, which kind of gives a brief overview of what TANF's stated goals are, just to sort of point out that really the very goals of the program and a lot of the rhetoric surrounding the TANF program from the very start was sort of riddled with some of these paternalistic notions about who was and who was not deserving of assistance. You'll see in these 4 points here that there was really a focus on dependency and on ending dependency and on marriage, rather than a focus on reducing poverty and providing support to folks so that they can reach a measure of economic security. And so this is the history that kind of continues to shape not only cash assistance and how it's designed and who does and doesn't get help, but also sort of these broader attitudes and assumptions about recipients of the program as well. Next slide. So now we're going to move into our findings. We used a framework that's called financial gaps, and this framework was developed by researchers at the Center for Social Policy at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And we used this framework because we felt that it was a helpful way of kind of focusing and grounding our analysis. And we'll walk you through some of the definitions of each gaps kind of as we go through. Next slide. So the first gap is what we call the eligibility gap. So this occurs when an individual or family's income is above eligibility for cash assistance while still being too low to meet their basic needs. Next slide. And so the first eligibility gap here has to do with the program's income eligibility threshold. So these thresholds are so restrictive that cash assistance doesn't even reach those with incomes below the already low federal poverty level. So just to kind of put a number to it, each year there are approximately 500,000 New Yorkers who receive cash assistance. But for example, in 2020, more than 2.5 million New Yorkers live below the federal poverty level. So even using this very low, outdated threshold of the federal poverty level, you can see that cash assistance is not even reaching a fraction of folks falling below that threshold. And again, this is a policy failure that is even more glaring, just considering how low and outdated that federal poverty level is. So that gulf between, who is in need and who actually receives assistance is actually much wider. And this is because eligibility for cash assistance has been historically tied to a measure called the standard of need, which is another sort of flawed, inadequate measure. And it's actually even more detached from economic reality than the federal poverty level. And so last year, luckily in the New York State budget, there were a number of changes to these thresholds to allow more folks to remain eligible. But as a more long-term solution, we would recommend adopting a more accurate threshold for determining eligibility. Next slide. So another way of sort of quantifying this issue was to look at the number of applicants who are denied each year specifically because of that income limit. And so we were able to obtain some data via a Freedom of Information Law request. And in this chart, it shows that approximately around 28,000 applicants each year are denied specifically because their income might just exceed that really low threshold. So it's a pretty significant number of folks who are sort of locked out of receiving assistance because of this limit in particular. Next slide. This next gap has to do with the issue of asset limits. So for cash assistance, there are asset limits that restrict applicants from having even modest savings. So applicants' assets cannot exceed $2,500. It's a little bit higher for folks who have someone 6 years of older or a person with a disability in their household, but generally still very low. And so many of you on this Zoom are from New York City or New York State, and we know that that amount, it wouldn't even be enough to rent an apartment in New York City, much less allow folks to even measure any sort of economic crisis. So it really doesn't allow for any sort of economic stability or safety net. And while in reality, it's extremely difficult for folks of this income level to save, these limits do prevent a number of New Yorkers from qualifying. So from 2020 to in 2021, over 4,000 applicants in New York State were denied specifically because of that very low asset limit. And this is, we include this data point for those 2 years, especially to point out that these were households that were denied assistance during the pandemic, when we all know that assets and savings really became a sort of a critical lifeline for many people. Next slide. The next financial gap is what's called a coverage gap. So this occurs when an individual or family qualifies for cash assistance, but does not receive it because of administrative challenges or other types of bureaucratic barriers. Next slide. And so the first coverage gap here has to do with the application and recertification processes. The Assembly member spoke to this earlier in her remarks as well. And we really just want to start by pointing out that, folks, when they're applying for cash assistance, they have to complete a lengthy application. They have to divulge, detailed information about their income, their expenses, their citizenship status, their education, and then they're also required to provide extensive amounts of documentation and attend an interview. And so these requirements are, unnecessarily burdensome and time consuming, especially considering that this is a group of folks who are already facing the enormous day-to-day burden of living in poverty. Next slide. And so again, just to sort of quantify what this issue means, we took a look at the total application denials for each year, and then looked at how many of those were denied specifically because of issues with the application process. So maybe someone wasn't able to submit all the paperwork required, or they weren't able to attend that interview. They might be denied assistance because of that issue. So we found that, as this chart shows, that over 122,000 applicants each year are denied specifically because of issues with that application process. So it's really kind of creating this barrier to access. Next slide. And then similarly, with the recertification process, a similar level of barrier there as well. So just quickly, recertification refers to this process in which folks who are already receiving cash assistance have to sort of periodically recertify that they are eligible. So they have to kind of go through this whole process to prove that they are still eligible to receive the benefit. And these numbers kind of show that there's all sorts of issues that come up with that process. So maybe if they didn't recertify right on time or weren't able to submit all the required materials, folks lose benefits because of that process. So it's very similar numbers actually to the previous slide with the application process. About 120,000 recipients each year lose benefits at recertification because of some issue related to that process. So another really significant barrier there. Next slide. And then so this next coverage gap has to do with work requirements. So recipients of cash assistance are required to engage in work activities unless they are determined to be exempt. And work requirements are a barrier for folks and are, a common reason why folks are denied benefits at their application or lose benefits later on in their process. And folks also might be penalized or sanctioned for not engaging in the work requirements. And so we found that from 2016 to 2021, almost 118,000 people were sanctioned due to work requirements. And so this really kind of both criminalizes and sort of exacerbates poverty instead of really addressing, you know, the real barriers to work that folks are facing. So, for example, many recipients of cash assistance report that they have limited education, limited job experience, lack of childcare. Maybe they're caring for a loved one or, you know, a child with an illness or a disability. And so instead of sort of addressing some of those barriers folks face, these are sort of, you know, broadly conceived and, you know, universally imposed mandates that don't really respond to what folks are experiencing. And beyond that, research also shows that people of color suffer disproportionately from the sort of unequal enforcement of work requirements, and that families of color, especially Black families, are more likely to be sanctioned than white families. So there's a, you know, real equity issue as well. Next slide. And then the last point about work requirements is that they have also been shown to push folks into low-wage jobs and jobs that really don't improve their long-term financial stability or improve their long-term employment success. So to get a better sense of this issue in New York State, we requested data on the average hourly wages of recipients. And so you'll see in this chart that as of 2021, outside of New York City, average wages were at about $13 an hour, and in New York City, they're just above $15 an hour. So still relatively very low wages for folks who are working and are, you know, participating in that work requirement. Next slide. This next coverage gap has to do with this issue of churn. So churn refers to this on again, off again enrollment pattern that characterizes many individuals' experiences with benefits programs. Next slide. And to get a better sense of just how common this issue of churn is in New York, we were able to obtain data on the number of cases that were closed and then reopened within a 1-year time frame. And so we found that 1 in 4 adults who exit the cash assistance program ultimately re-enter within 1 year. So this is anywhere from 16,000 to 23,000 adults, and then even more children who continue to experience poverty and sort of economic volatility after leaving the program and then ultimately re-enter. Next slide. And then this last gap is what's called the hardship gap. So this is when an individual or family is receiving cash assistance, but their resources remain below what they need to meet their needs, even after taking into account the value of cash assistance and any other types of income that they're receiving. Next slide. So this first point is, you know, stating what you all know to be true, that the cash assistance benefit levels are inadequate, and they are far below the self-sufficiency benchmark, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So by the hardship gap definition, you know, we found that all recipients of cash assistance are experiencing some form of that hardship gap. Next slide. And so just to get a better sense of this, we compared this to the self-sufficiency standard. And so you'll see that in the middle there for New York County, the maximum monthly cash assistance benefit is just $789, while according to the self-sufficiency standard, this same family in the same county would need over $10,000 to meet their basic needs. So it's covering just about 8% of that household's basic needs. And then in Albany County, similar there, it would cover just under 13% of that household's basic needs. Next slide. And so the next hardship gap has to do with the grant allowance for housing, which is called the shelter allowance, which is supposed to serve as sort of rental or housing assistance, but it's actually far below the cost of housing in each county in New York. Next slide. And so to illustrate this, we used the Housing and Urban Development Fair Market Rent estimates. And so you'll see that in the middle there, in the Bronx, for instance, the shelter allowance would cover just 19% of HUD's fair market rent. So homelessness and housing instability continues to be, a real challenge for folks receiving cash assistance. Next slide. And then the last hardship gap here has to do again with asset limits. So while those receiving cash assistance have met that initial asset limit test to qualify, they're also still subject to that rule while receiving cash assistance. So luckily the asset limit for recipients was recently increased to $10,000. But even at a higher threshold, recipients are still sort of relegated to economic insecurity as a condition of maintaining their eligibility. And we'll talk a bit more about this when we get to the recommendations, but this is also just an issue because we know that lower income groups also face significant income volatility, and just having a level of savings is so critical for folks to be able to manage through those periods. And then, beyond sort of the economic security piece of it, just having assets provides this sort of level of dignity and peace of mind that really all New Yorkers deserve. And we saw during the pandemic just how critical it was for folks to have some sort of safety net to manage through that time. And again, we'll talk a bit more about this in the next section. But now I'm going to turn it over to Joe Jones, who's the Director of Policy, to kind of walk us through the recommendations in the report.
Thanks, Julia. Can everyone? All right, Alex, you can go to the next slide. So we're going to talk today a little bit about recommendations, and you're going to hear me keep using a couple of the same phrases over and over again. And one of those phrases is a both and phrase, right? Which is to say that as we're addressing these issues and recommending program improvements to the cash assistance program in New York, we cannot lose sight of the fact that there are deeper and structural issues that FPWA is also working on, that there are issues related to even things as simple as how we measure poverty that is immoral and is unequitable in the way that we even measure it, so let alone how we talk about combating it. So you're going to hear me talk about things that are systemic and things that are sort of implementable things to address cash assistance specifically. And we must do both of these things at the same time in order for us to make meaningful change for New Yorkers and living in these conditions and who receive cash assistance and who sort of suffer the consequences of economic deprivation. So the fortunate thing is within our state, we have leaders in the Assembly and in the Senate who, like Senator Persaud and Assemblymember Rosenthal, who joined us earlier, who have been thinking about these issues. And so a number of our recommendations are actually to pass legislation which has already been proposed. So this is a call for anyone listening that this is the next step, is to sort of implement these things that we have already sort of written and drafted and move them forward. So the first recommendation to a point that has been made earlier is that we understand that the benefits for all recipients are just far, far too low. For both FA and SNA, the benefits, as Julia pointed out, are between 8 and 13% of what a family needs to survive. So fortunately, Senators Rosenthal, or sorry, Assemblymember Rosenthal and Senators Persaud introduced some legislation last session that would have increased the non-shelter component of the grant amount and at least tied it to the cost of inflation. So that's everything that folks use to cover things like utilities, food, and other necessities would be finally tied to inflation as opposed to being indexed to the 1996 standards. But also Senators Kavanaugh and Assemblymember Rosenthal introduced a second bill, which Julia mentioned about the shelter allowance component of this cash assistance program. And the second bill would actually increase the shelter allowance to 100% of HUD's fair market rate, as opposed to covering the sort of dismal portion that it does now. Um, so in addition to increasing the amount for recipients, we really need to enroll additional people in cash assistance. As we know, the way that cash assistance is measured is through a standard which is even below the federal poverty measure, which itself is flawed and immorally low. Uh, so there has been legislation proposed that would increase the eligibility for cash assistance to 200% of the federal poverty limit. And this would replace the current standard of need, which is even lower than the immoral level of the FPL. So I think that there's one of the things that we're very clear on is more people need to be able to benefit from the programs that are set out to help them, for people who are living in these situations of economic deprivation. Another example would be to allow more people who are receiving higher asset or higher income to be enrolled in the program. There's a bill introduced by Senators Rosenthal and Persaud that would increase some of the disregards, income disregards, that will allow people to make additional money in certain job training programs that would not be counted toward their overall income, therefore increasing the amount of people who can apply for the program. Let's move on to the next slide. Additionally, as Julia mentioned, the asset limits significantly limit the number of people who are eligible for the program. There's legislation that would remove asset limits from the application process entirely. And this has actually been done in several other states. And so this is New York catching up with our peer states across the country. Uh, the removal of asset limits would allow people to not only make this calculation between trading off short-term gains by receiving cash assistance against their sort of long-term economic stability by having assets in the bank, but it would also allow us to save costs by removing the very costly and time-consuming process of verifying the assets that people attest to in their application. This is one of those examples where if we remove the sort of paternalistic and classist values that underlie cash assistance, we actually realize cost savings, not necessarily increased costs. A second point would be to reform the work requirements. As we know, unfortunately, for the FA portion of cash assistance, which is federally funded, the work requirements cannot be removed. However, for SNA, which is the state-funded portion, the asset or the work requirements can entirely be removed, and we would advocate for that to happen. And even for SA or for the FA portion, which is federally funded, we would like to see a broader definition of what is encompassed in work that allows for additional flexibility. And as Julia mentioned earlier, it really helps people who are receiving these programs to actually achieve the goals that they are looking for. We saw during the pandemic that there was people were unable to go out to work. They were unable to work in person because of various reasons. And this would actually be one of those processes that will allow people more flexibility and would allow them to retain jobs and not be sanctioned for failing to meet that. We can move to the next slide. So additional things that we want is I will actually cover two of these in one, which is to reduce the churn and simplify the application process and recertification process. These are extremely lengthy. They have multiple steps. They require literal mountains of documentation for one application. And because of this, that 1/4 number of people who are removed from the program that are reapplying within a year, and the constant churn is administratively costly and administratively burdensome to the program. In addition, we would like greater investment in basic assistance. As of now, just 28% of the dollars that we receive from TANF are allocated to basic assistance or cash assistance. However, we know from research that cash assistance does improve the ability for people to meet their basic needs. It improves health, it improves food security, and all of the related costs that happen when you're able to provide assistance to people and allow them the ability to spend it in the ways that they see fit. And the last recommendation that we have in this section is really to think about measuring the sort of outcomes of the cash assistance programs, both FA and SNA. The first step to really solving any of the problems that these programs purport to address is to actually understand the situation, to study it. And because the OTDA does not measure any of sort of outcomes, it's impossible to say whether these programs are actually successful in the goal of helping to remove people out of poverty into economic stability. Additionally, we hope that the data is disaggregated by race and gender, which we know that there are disparities in the racial and gender makeup of the programs. Let's move to the next slide. So these are specific recommendations that we have for the city of New York. The city has actually done, in some ways, a different job than the state of addressing some of the problems. And so our recommendations, at least in some cases, are really tailored to what the process looks like now in New York City. And the first one is really to implement a trauma-informed care approach. As we heard earlier from Assemblymember Rosenthal, these sort of problems that people face, whether they're food insecurity, housing scarcity, whether it's childcare, domestic violence, these are all additional interrelated problems. And having an approach that recognizes that there are interrelated problems that people are facing and that these challenges are not lived in silos, but really are sort of a whole person approach and a trauma informed approach to the delivery of services. This looks something like not having strict that are punitive with their consequences, that are reducing the unnecessary power dynamics, that allow participants to share their goals and help them to determine how the program can best be suited and tailored to fit them and support them. Additionally, we call on the city to increase the resources available to increase accessibility and uptake of FA and SNA. As we mentioned before, too few people who even are qualified for these programs are actually accessing them. And so this program would, or this recommendation rather, would call on the city to increase the availability and the advertising and awareness of the programs. It would also call on the city to increase resources such as social workers who can sort of address not just the applicant, but also potentially the applicant's household, helping them navigate areas such as education, employment, housing, and healthcare, all of which we see related to increasing churn and are related to the adjacent consequences of poverty. We can move to the next slide. So this is really where we sort of look at, as I mentioned before, that both and approach, where we're thinking about things that are a call for systemic change as we make these specific recommendations for changes to the cash assistance program. The sort of systemic issues of widespread poverty and racism in our country, and that sort of go hand in hand with economic deprivation, wage inequality. These are things that FPWA are working in tandem to promote policies to improve as we sort of make these recommendations to improve the individual programs itself. We know that these programs are targeted to the lowest of the low, and while helping people at these low incomes sort of sort of rising tide lifts all boats approach, we also understand that there are these systemic barriers that are preventing them from achieving true equity and true equality. Let's move to the next slide. So what do some of these recommendations for systemic change look like? So first, it looks like replacing the federal poverty level. As you've heard a couple of times today, the federal poverty level is immorally low. It was established at a time when food was the major cost of a person's budget. It does not take into account anything like housing. There's no geographic adjacency to it. It really is a very flat, unwieldy tool for understanding what need looks like. So replacing that with something that measures a more accurate true cost of living is uh, of understanding how we can begin to address poverty and economic deprivation in this country. If we, again, as I mentioned, if we do not study, if we do not understand, if we do not have the data, we cannot begin to address the problem. Uh, this also looks like helping to raise wages. This looks like wages which are in some respects at least tied to what need looks like. And if we are not accurately measuring need, then we are not accurately allowing people to know what wages should be in order for people to survive. This looks like establishing programs to provide universal childcare, affordable housing, expanding the child tax credit, and providing affordable quality healthcare. Um, and lastly, we want to also make mention of sort of guaranteed income proposals and policies which end racial disparities. Racial disparities are rife within the system, as we know that there are huge racial components and aspects, not only in the way the programs are administered, but also in the data around who faces economic deprivation and who are living in poverty. So finding programs and policies that end these racial disparities by targeting them to those who are in the most need will also help to eliminate the sort of widespread economic deprivation we see in our society. And as cash assistance itself is a model for what it looks like when you give people cash and benefits, we have seen additional models pop up across many cities, states, and localities providing guaranteed income. And we see that there's clear evidence that providing income not only reduces poverty, but also improves these sort of other adjacent outcomes for adults, children, and families across the country. We can move to the next slide. So in terms of the next steps on, as I mentioned, this sort of both and process, we are continuing to push these systemic changes, and we welcome all partners to get involved with our work to alleviate these sort of systemic and systematic barriers that prevent economic mobility, that prevent economic justice, true economic justice. But in terms of our next steps in addressing New York City's and New York State's cash assistance programs, we are building a statewide coalition, and we are excited that some of our partners from the Empire Justice Center and the Legal Aid Society are building this coalition with us. And the coalition will have two real primary goals. The first will be the legislative priorities that I mentioned earlier, which will increase the grant amount, will remove asset limits, will reform work requirements. And the second, and it's one I think that is interesting, is really what we're calling a narrative change component. We've sort of lost track in our society of welfare, cash assistance, and it's sort of become a dirty word. We are looking to change the narrative around not only the terms, but also understanding of who the people are who are receiving it. We're looking to educate the public, educate stakeholders, to really develop relationships with elected officials on the importance of the cash assistance program. And as we sort of build this groundswell, this grassroots groundswell of understanding about cash assistance and really bring it back into the forefront in a way that it has not been in almost 30 years in sort of combating these negative stereotypes, both of the program and also the people who receive the program. It'll help us to highlight the gaps that exist in this program and will help us to build these coalitions that are necessary to passing the reforms and the changes that we need. So now I'm going to turn it over to, I believe it's Risa, who's going to sort of help us do our Q&A portion.
I'll do the Q&A here
Oh,
at the
sorry.
end. Yeah, so I know we're kind of getting to the end of our time, but we did actually just get a question in the chat about the federal government's role in sort of reforming these programs, which is a great question. And so just to quickly answer that, we focused our advocacy on the state level for the most part, especially because there's already legislation that exists. And so we felt that, you know, the state could move forward on these issues in a really significant way. I do know that there was sort of a renewed conversation at the federal level a couple years ago when we marked the 25th anniversary of the PURA legislation. And so a number of national research organizations and think tanks, you know, published a bunch of papers about kind of where we are 25 years out and kind of calling for, you know, key reforms to that program and essentially changing the structure so that TANF isn't just a fixed block grant, but actually, you know, expands to meet needs. So I would say there's at least some conversation on the federal level, although our advocacy is more focused on the state. We can just take, I don't see any other questions, but we can just take one more here about how to get involved in the coalition. So if you are interested in joining that effort, you can reach out to me directly and we'll make sure you have the information to be a part of that coalition moving forward. So I will definitely share my email here in the chat. Okay. And just given that we are at 11, I think we'll just end it here. We will be following up with a recording of the this event, as well as a 2-pager and the slides from the event as well. And again, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me directly. And as we wrap up, I just want to make sure we thank our funders, New York Community Trust, and JP Morgan Chase & Co. for their very generous support of our work always. So thank you all for joining us. And we hope you, you know, learned something from the event today and that you might be interested in being more involved going forward. So thank you.
We want to take the time also to thank our speakers from the state legislature. Thank you again to Senators Persaud and Assembly members Rosenthal for attending and their staffs for really helping to spearhead this.
Thank
you all
you.
for
Thank you,
joining.
everybody.